Do you think AI is going to help with things like this?
No, no, no. So AI with things like Copilot, AI is already demonstrating a pretty serious advancement. I have a podcast on AI. My co-host Marty Wiener, former CTO of Reddit, he abandoned his preferred text editor in order to be able to try out Copilot, and he's like, "This is a game changer. This is a completely new way of thinking about code." And I'm sure it is. However, it's occupying the same mental universe that all the rest of us are, and like all of us, if it were possible to cleanly create bug-free programs, then it would be possible to compute things that we know it's impossible to compute, and so it isn't possible to do that.
So, just coming back a little bit to the time travel AI paper, what are your thoughts on time travel in any way? And just in terms of it maybe not being possible in our lifetime, but are the implications getting closer?
Well, time travel has some pretty serious philosophical issues with causality. However, from a sci-fi perspective, I'm a big fan of sci-fi. There are some pretty fun sci-fi time travel stories.
I'm
I
curious what you
actually,
believe, though. We can go into them, but I definitely want to know your belief.
oh, belief-wise, I pretty much centralize things being coherently sensible, and so the breaking of causality implicit in time travel means that I don't think that it's physically real. Um, there, there is a physical nature of time travel that is where it would be ubiquitous but unexperienceable.
Okay.
So
You can think
the
of like meditation or something.
No, 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 no. So the sort of the basic physics arrow entropy thing is that, say, you can watch a glass fall off a counter and shatter on the floor, and many people have seen things like this, but you cannot watch a scattered profusion of like orange juice and shards on a floor reassemble themselves into a full glass sitting on a table. Nobody's ever observed that to happen. But the equations of motion and energy and so on that we have are time symmetric. So they don't say anything about which direction of those things is possible.
Ah,
However, part of the system of that glass falling on the floor and shattering is your observation and memories of that glass falling on the floor and shattering, and communications that you might have with people in other rooms of, oh crap, that they hear and their memories of what they heard and so on. And so an implication of the time reversal nature of those equations, where the glass, reassembles itself and jumps back on the counter, is the simultaneous erasure of those perceptions and memories. So there could be something that caused time to rewind by a decade, but then all persons' experience of that decade would be wiped free from the universe, and there would be nothing that happened as a result of that rewinding, and
that
that's
seems to
physically
be,
plausible.
yeah, that seems to be what it always comes back to is like time is all directions and the outcome is still the same, right?
Well, in these cases, the outcome would not have to be the same, but every experience that exists would be part of a continuously accumulated experience that's of increasing entropy.
Do you shoot
But
down string theory?
uh, I I don't find string theory to be particularly persuasive. It's continually fails the test of going back to Feynman. There's actually he mentions this in his books as well, but there's a very famous video of him up at a chalkboard talking about the scientific process. And he was sort of a very blunt-spoken type of person with this strong New York accent, which I will not attempt to imitate. But he says the first thing you do is you guess. We have a lot of fancy words, but that's what it is. It's a guess. And then you do some math to figure out what the consequences of your guess are. And then you do an experiment to see what actually happens. And if what actually happens doesn't match up with what your predictions are, then you're wrong and you have to
Interesting.
guess again.
That's interesting. You actually sparked another thought because I've been saying that the future of like hiring and employment is going to be you ask an AI a question that you have, and then you go refer to your employees and then see who came up with the idea that closely matches the original AI's idea. That's what I think the future of like promotion and like this person's onto something he knew type of I don't know. It's just I'm seeing the different aspects of how you can use it to identify talent in a way. Does that make sense?
Potentially, but I think we're up against a rethinking of how employment functions in a
That's
very deep
real.
way. So one of the consequences if we get ubiquitous computing availability is that many of the capabilities that are right now isolated to people with billions of dollars could become the common property of many, many people. And so, under those circumstances, the kinds of relationships that currently exist between, Fortune 500 multinationals might be relatively appropriate to be between people who are running small independent businesses. And I personally would find it much more congenial to live in a world where people were economically capable of producing something of value. Sort of the average person was able to do that without being forced into some kind of bureaucratic large structure that was primarily concerned with its own political interests that have nothing to do with external reality.
Yeah, it was pretty concerning hearing Elon just flat out be like, we're gonna have to introduce some kind of basic income. And it's like, wow, if you're already predicting that for the future, it's kind of stark. But
So we actually had somebody on our show advocating for UBIs. I'm not a proponent. I view it as effectively a defensive measure by those who are presently successful to try to maintain structures of the present day that allow them to be regarded as successful. And I think that that's basically insane. But we'll see how it fights out in sort of the hurly burly
the,
of human
yeah,
existence.
I definitely think the idea is to make us reliant so we don't have a choice in some aspect. But changing the topic a little bit, what is your thought on double slit experiment in terms of the metaphorical aspects? Because you know how people a lot of misinterpret the aspect of what it is up front, and they think it's something it's not. So I'm curious on
So you're talking
your
about the
opinion.
quantum double slit where
Yeah.
you can observe things happening in ways that make very little sense. Yeah, well, it's real. Like it's something that if you're curious, you can do in your own home. It's not that terrifically difficult to set up a double
Hmm,
slit. Uh,
never thought about it.
yeah, I've seen it. I've participated in the experiment before, and to me, it's one of those things that points out in the 1900s. So in 1900, quantum mechanics was developed. That's when Max Planck and made his observation or his theory that we could account for the ultraviolet catastrophe by assuming that energy came in distinct blocks. And then, just a few years later, Einstein makes his contribution to quantum physics and also to special relativity, and observes that space and time have an interrelationship that isn't decomposable, and as a consequence of this, light bends around the sun. It's a few decades later that Alan Turing demonstrates general computability, and and in order to introduce this concept of incomputability. So here's a machine that can carry out any possible calculation, and here's things that this machine can't produce because no calculation, no process you can even imagine can produce these outcomes. And that was an extension of Gödel's work in incompleteness. The idea that logic wasn't good enough to prove itself,